You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In late August 1777, after a tough 34-day sail from Sandy Hook, New Jersey, more than 260 ships of the Royal Navy, carrying around 17,000 British soldiers led by General Sir William Howe, arrived at the Elk River's head, near what's now Elkton, Maryland, back then called Head of Elk, which is roughly 40 to 50 miles southwest of Philadelphia. The area was tricky for unloading because of its narrow, shallow, and muddy riverbanks. General George Washington had his American force, numbering about 20,300, set up between Head of Elk and Philadelphia. They were able to watch the British landings from a spot near Newark, Delaware, known as Iron Hill, which is about 9 miles northeast. The British faced delays getting off their ships, which meant they didn't set up a regular camp and moved quickly inland. This rush kept Washington from getting a good read on the British force's size. After a small clash near Couch's Bridge, south of Newark, the British headed north. Washington then pulled back from a defensive position by the Red Clay Creek near Newport, Delaware, to face the British at Chad's Ford. This location was key as it offered the most direct route across the Brandywine River on the way from Baltimore to Philadelphia. On September 9th, Washington spread his forces to guard the fords around Chad's Ford, aiming to make a stand there. He had around 1,000 Pennsylvania militiamen, led by General John Armstrong, at Piles Ford to the south, while Major Generals Anthony Wayne and Nathaniel Greene, along with others, held positions to the north and south of Chad's Ford, securing the area. The British, meanwhile, were not far away at Kennett Square. Howe, having better local knowledge than Washington, planned not for a head-on battle, but a sneak attack. About 6,800 of Howe's men, under Wilhelm von Kniphausen, advanced directly towards Washington's forces at Chad's Ford. The rest, around 9,000 men, led by Lord Cornwallis, took a longer route, moving north and then east to cross the Brandywine Creek at points Washington hadn't covered due to a mix of poor information and scouting. This move aimed to surprise and flank the American troops. On the morning of September 11th, a thick fog settled in, offering a hidden advantage to the British forces. George Washington, receiving mixed messages on where the British troops were heading, mistakenly thought their primary target was Chad's Ford. The operation known as Kniphausen's Column kicked off at 5:30 in the morning, with British and Hessian soldiers beginning their march eastward along what is now Route 1 from Kennett Square, aiming straight for the American forces stationed at Brandywine Creek's crossing. The battle's first exchange of fire happened near Welsh's Tavern, situated about 4 miles west of Chad's Ford. Here, a forward group of American light infantry under Maxwell clashed with the leading British units, among which were the Loyalist Queen's Rangers. Despite this initial resistance, the British troops kept moving forward and soon faced off against a larger American force. This larger skirmish unfolded around the old Kennett Meeting House, where inside, despite the chaos erupting outdoors, a group of Quakers conducted their midweek service in peace. A Quaker reflected on the event, noting the contrast between the turmoil outside and the calm within. The skirmishes pushed on for 3 miles, all the way to Brandywine Creek near Chad's Ford, with the British forces eventually overpowering the Americans, though not without significant losses on their side. Early in the morning at 5:00 a.m., General Cornwallis, with General Howe by his side, led the main British forces from Kennett Square. Thanks to helpful tips from local Loyalists, Howe knew about 2 unprotected fords upriver from the Brandywine Forks. Their march was a lengthy one, covering 17 miles over about 9 hours. By 2 p.m., the British managed to sneak up on the right side of the American forces and decided to pause at Osborne's Hill, a strategic spot just north of the Continental Army, to catch their breath. In the meantime, the American side had been tipped off by Colonel Bland's scouts, prompting General Washington to instruct Sullivan to head north with additional troops from Sterling and Stevens' divisions to confront this flanking maneuver by the British. As the American troops were getting into formation north of Dilworth, Howe initiated his attack. Sullivan, now leading the right wing of the army, briefly left his post to coordinate with other generals, leaving his division under the temporary charge of Prudhomme de Boer, with specific instructions to adjust their positioning to connect seamlessly with Sterling and Stevens' divisions. However, as the British, including the Hessian Jaegers, pushed forward, they threatened to outmaneuver the American right flank. This compelled Stevens and Sterling to also move to the right. Even though Howe was somewhat slow in attacking, this delay allowed some American units to secure a stronger position on elevated ground near Birmingham Meeting House, which is roughly a mile north of Chad's Ford. By 4 p.m., the British went into full attack mode. They caught de Boer's forces off guard on the American left flank, causing immediate confusion and a rapid retreat within that division. Despite a valiant effort, the pressure from the British light infantry and Jaegers eventually overwhelmed Stephen's division, pushing them back. A fierce charge by the British grenadiers broke through the centre, forcing Stirling's division to also withdraw. It was amidst this chaos that the Marquis de Lafayette, newly arrived and fighting alongside Stirling's division, was wounded as he bravely attempted to rally the retreating soldiers. Around 6 in the evening, Washington and Greene came with backup forces to try holding back the British, who had taken over Meeting House Hill. Washington had a strategy meeting with Greene and Knox, who was in charge of the big guns, right in the yard of the William Brinton House. The 2nd Battalion of British Grenadiers was almost upon them, reinforced by a new bunch of troops, the 4th British Brigade. They decided Knox would set up artillery to slow down the British. Greene's fresh troops, along with the surviving forces from Sullivan, Stephen and Stirling, regrouped south of Dilworth. They managed to hold off the British chase for about an hour, buying time for the rest of their army to pull back. As night came, Greene's division, along with the remaining forces, started moving towards Chester. The British couldn't follow because it was getting dark. The Americans had to leave a lot of their cannons behind on Meeting House Hill, as nearly all the horses that could carry the artillery had been killed. When Cornwallis's troops attacked, Knyphausen saw an opportunity and led an assault on the American forces stationed at Chad's Ford. This move was effective, breaking through the lines held by troops under the command of Wayne and William Maxwell, which resulted in the Americans having to pull back and abandon most of their cannons in the process. Armstrong's militia, who hadn't yet participated in the battle, also decided to pull out from their positions. To the north, Greene took action by ordering Brigadier General George Weedon's soldiers to position themselves near Dilworth. Their mission was to cover a key road, delaying the British just long enough for the rest of the Continental Army to safely withdraw. However, as night fell, the British had to halt their pursuit, allowing Weedon's soldiers to also make their retreat. After their defeat, the American forces regrouped and headed toward Chester, with most of them reaching the town by midnight. A few were lagging behind, but managed to arrive by the morning. Despite the chaos, the retreat was remarkably organized, a feat largely credited to Lafayette. Despite being injured himself, Lafayette played a crucial role by establishing a rally point which greatly contributed to the orderly withdrawal of the troops. It was only after ensuring this that Lafayette sought treatment for his injury. Let's break down the details of the casualties from a historical battle, making sure everything is easy to follow for our listeners. The official British records show they suffered 587 casualties. This included 93 individuals who were killed, consisting of 8 officers, 7 sergeants and 78 ordinary soldiers, 488 who were wounded, including 49 officers, 40 sergeants, 4 drummers, and 395 rank and file soldiers, and 6 soldiers went missing. Out of all these casualties on the British side, only 40 were Hessians, who were German soldiers hired to fight for Britain. Historian Thomas J. Maguire points out that American estimates of British losses were much higher, sometimes reaching up to 2,000. This discrepancy likely stems from observations made from a distance and reports that were not entirely reliable. When it comes to American losses, much of what we know comes from British sources. One British officer initially reported more than 200 Americans killed, around 750 wounded and 400 taken as prisoners, many among them wounded. A staff member of General Howe, the British commander, mentioned that 400 rebels were buried by the victors. Another British officer tallied 502 dead Americans on the field. General Howe himself reported to Lord George Germain that the Americans suffered about 300 killed, 600 wounded, and nearly 400 prisoners. No American records of casualties at the Battle of Brandywine have survived, and no official numbers were ever published. The closest to an accurate estimate from the American side came from Major General Nathaniel Greene, who thought Washington's army lost between 1,200 and 1,300 men. Following the battle, roughly 350 wounded Americans were moved from the British camp at Dilworth to a new hospital in Wilmington, Delaware. This move suggests that of the near 400 prisoners Howe mentioned, about 50 had not been wounded. If General Greene's estimate is correct, the American losses, including those killed, wounded, or deserted, would number between 1,160 and 1,260. Additionally, the British captured 11 of the American Army's 14 artillery pieces. Notably, among the wounded Americans was the Marquis de Lafayette, a key figure in the American Revolution. It's also worth mentioning that during this time, 315 men were reported as deserters from General Washington's camp, indicating the challenges faced beyond the immediate losses in battle. Washington made a big mistake by leaving his army's right side unprotected, which could have led to a disaster. Thankfully, divisions led by Sullivan, Sterling, and Stephen stepped up to slow down the enemy, buying crucial time. As evening came, although the opposing General Cornwallis started his attack early, most of the American troops managed to get away. Washington shared with the Continental Congress that despite the setbacks of the day, his soldiers were still ready and willing to continue the fight against the British, saying, "Despite the day's misfortune, I am pleased to announce that most of my men are in good spirits and still have the courage to fight the enemy another day." In the days following, British and American forces played a game of cat and mouse, with only a few actual battles like the Battle of the Clouds on September 16th and another fierce clash, the Battle of Paoli, on the night of September 20th to 21st. Then came the battles of Saratoga, far to the north, which ended in a significant win against a British force that General Howe had been expected to reinforce. As Philadelphia braced for a British takeover, Pennsylvania's leaders decided to protect key symbols of freedom. They ordered the removal of 11 important bells, including the Liberty Bell and those from Christ Church and St. Peter's Church. This was to stop the British from melting them down for ammunition. The Liberty Bell was secretly taken to Allentown, hidden under floorboards at Zion United Church of Christ for 9 months. With British forces closing in, the Continental Congress had to leave Philadelphia. They briefly moved to Lancaster before settling in York. On September 26, 1777, British troops entered Philadelphia without facing any resistance. Today, the legacy of the Battle of Brandywine lives on in the U.S. military. 8 Army National Guard units and 1 regular Army Field Artillery battalion trace their origins back to this battle, part of the 30 U.S. Army units, with lineages dating back to the early days of America's fight for independence. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.